Ian, this was an article that came to my attention, and I'm not sure if you saw me cover a similar article, not similar, but from the same author, Ian Bogost of The Atlantic, saying Nintendo's sad struggle for survival back in December, and how, Nintendo is just clawing, trying to get to the top of the cliff, that they're doomed. Obviously, that's an insane thought, even before the Switch's success. But he came back with an article asking, video games are better without, not even asking, telling us that video games are better without stories. Film, television, and literature all tell them better. So why are games still obsessed with narrative? And I didn't read the article in its entirety, but I did skim it. And what I gathered from this was just because, like he said, because video games are behind other mediums in telling stories, that really games shouldn't focus on that and focus what they are doing, that, reconstructing bits and pieces of our reality as we view them, so to speak. It's an interesting argument, but obviously it's one that I think the vast majority of gamers wouldn't really agree with. Because as you go back into time, the best way to really file narrative in gaming is to go back in time and look at the original games. Look at Pong, where there's no story besides the cute struggle of paddles to survive their game of table tennis. And then as you go forward to the first game recognized as having a no narrative, Donkey Kong, where yes, you could have just had them be stick figures running up, a construction site to rescue another stick figure, but now we changed it to having a carpenter trying to save his girlfriend from for some reason, having a pet gorilla, and adding some sort of narrative. And then as you get further, a game like Wolfenstein 3D, yes, it could just be shooting random people in hallways, but you're trying to escape, Castle Wolfenstein in World War II as an agent, BJ Blazkowicz. So just from sprinkling in stories, or just the backstory at least, you can see that we remember these games, as I have, and I think it makes us want to play them more, just from having even the semblance of a story attached to them. It helps you be immersed more into them. So just on its surface, I think this article is just strange because without having some sort of backstory or story in games, you are far more limited in what you could tell. You are more limited to those, say, single screen games like Space Invaders, which even has a story. Aliens are attacking the Earth. You can't really get away with it unless you really get down to the nitty gritty games like Snake, where it's like, yeah, there could be a story, but not really.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of this article, and I seem to remember the other one you mentioned. The thing is, I've read a lot of things by this author that I have liked in the past. This is not exactly one of them. Mostly because I think by the end of the article, because I did read it all the way through, I think he kind of gets lost in his. I think he kind of gets lost in the argument he's trying to make, but I don't think he's legitimately arguing for no story. I don't think that's what he's actually legitimately like saying, no story. I think what he's talking about are these games that have essentially become entirely focused on telling too much story, and how really all it is moving from point to point, and basically something happens and you receive a chunk of story, and then you keep going, and then you receive another chunk, and how as that sort of narrative, it's not cohesive. It's not particularly good at doing that. I'm not saying I agree with this, but I think that's kind of what he's getting at.
But not all games do that. Even in the examples,
No.
he cited a couple.
Yeah,
I think one was Gone Home.
Right.
So
he says that this is a better way for it to be done, but then he gets into how it amounts to nothing more than teen drama, and at that point I think then it gets a bit pretentious.
A little backhanded compliment.
Yeah, and I think Gone Home is interesting, and I think a game that can tell a story as you're playing it is a good game. I think that's a very interesting thing, and I think games can do that fairly well without having such blunt things as, voice recorders placed everywhere or
Sure.
something like that. But there is something to be said about finding, at least for me, a more natural way to tell a story. What gets me about this is he talks about how, and I'm trying to find it in here, about how games are made from other things, and what the goal of, or what is kind of ideal about games is taking mechanics and taking them apart and putting them back together. About how like Candy Crush is made from Bejeweled, and how Gone Home was made from BioShock, and constantly taking these pieces apart and putting them back together in new ways. And about how like it's one of the newer games. The Disappearance of Edith Finch, mixes like comic book style and all these neat things, but you need a story to make those neat things interesting. Whereas he's arguing that's not because of the story; it's because of unique usages of the 3D game engine. But to me, without any, it kind of goes back to what you say. Without any backing reasoning for doing this, what's I don't get it. And I love plenty of games without stories. I play score attack games and scrolling shooters mostly, where it's aliens are there. I don't need a story to enjoy that, but for something like that, I need a purpose.
But it's interesting that he says, and I was trying to allude to it, combining parts, disassembling. That's what storytelling is, though. As there's only, what was it? Here it is. 7 story archetypes. Going back into time, there's really 7 types of stories that you can tell. Overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, rebirth. Okay? Every story that's been told, by and large, it's one of those 7 themes. It's just the details of the hero, or what type of villain is it. That's the only things that change. It's all the same pieces that are interchangeable. So with games, of course, based upon the genre and based upon the generation, that could be dramatically different from year to year. But I don't see the advantage of not even attempting to infuse a story into your game, because your imagination can work if there's nothing. So, for example, if Super Mario Brothers was presented with the same exact characters, but didn't tell you any backstory, didn't tell you this was the Mushroom Kingdom, didn't tell you this was Bowser trying to take it over, could you still get enjoyment out of that game? Absolutely, you can get enjoyment. But just giving you in the instruction manual, the 2 or 3 paragraphs of backstory, it livens up the entire experience, because you can imagine yourself playing something greater than what's on screen. It's more than the sum of its parts at that point. And I think that's where you have to remember that also video games as a medium themselves, where you have a narrative, are less than 40 years old. Right?
Yeah.
So even if the author makes a complaint that, well, it doesn't tell stories as well as, movies or TV or literature.
We're working with something incredibly young.
Yes. Literature's been around for, at least in English, for about a little over 1,000 years. Right? And then TV and radio, over 100 years combined. Just about. Oh, well, yeah, radio. Just about. And then obviously theater, which can build up to movies. Theater's been around for who knows, since caveman days, when I killed the mammoth, this is how I did it.
If you focus on just literature and theater,
that's enough.
That's...
And plus the difference also is that the main goal of video games isn't necessarily to tell a story. It enhances it. The main goal of creating a video game is to create an interactive experience that could be attached to a story.
Right.
So I think it might catch up, but I don't think it'll ever be obviously as grand as what you can do in terms of blowing you away, TV, movies, since that's their bread and butter. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's always going to be gameplay first. Now let's attach the story to it on the back end.